Hello, 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 and good evening. Today is Thursday, February 19th. It is 5:30 p.m. That means it's time for Let's Talk Power Live. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Tanji Reed Marshall. I am your show host, and I'm excited to welcome you back to another episode, evening chat of Let's Talk Power Live. It's Black History Month. We're in the third week. I cannot believe it's almost the end of February. Where did it go? I do not know. But I'm excited to welcome you back. And I want to talk a minute and talk about what am I thankful for? Every week we talk about being thankful. This week I am thankful for the fact that one, the snow is melting where I am. I don't know where you are, but the snow is melting and it's making me feel very happy. And I'm just thankful for today's conversation. We're going to be talking about leadership through another lens. But before we get started, let me remind you, invite you to number one, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and hit the share button. In education, we talk about a lot of issues and a lot of topics. We talk about power, but here with Let's Talk Power Live, we talk about power in a very operational, concrete way. So go ahead, subscribe, like, and share. So tonight, over the last few weeks, actually, I want to go back a little bit. Over the last few weeks, we have talked about power like we do every week. We've talked about our community power. We have talked about our instructional power, the power that we have inherited. And tonight, we're going to be talking about leadership power. But we're going to talk about it through the lens of the assistant principal, not the principal. And I chose the assistant principal conversation because, number one, it's important to understand that power is not just about who has the seat right now. It's about who's going to occupy the seat tomorrow, down the road. And being an AP isn't just about being prepared operationally. You've got to also have some other skills. And I can't believe and can't imagine I have the opportunity to talk to a wonderful lady who is lighting up the world. She's got a new book coming out, and it is my honor and privilege to bring Dr. Bobbie Mills to the stage. And so I look forward to having our conversation tonight. And before I do that, you know what I always ask you? I always talk about the idea of why people want me to talk about power. And so what they talk about power is, what is it? What is power in education? Skinny Lao J, hi, thank you for being here. So every week I ask you about this. And so I talk to you about what is power in education. I want to share what it is. Education is the instrument of democratic designs, and it is no less the instrument of power. The control of information, the shaping of understanding, and the influence of judgment are critical elements common to democratic design, power theory, and educational philosophy. That's from David Nyberg, 1981. I quote this in my book. It is a critical statement. But that's what educational power is writ large. But here is the next level of this. The next piece of this is instructional power. What is instructional power? Well, here it is. It is the understanding that it is an educator's use of their state, district, and building ascribed job-related authority to afford or constrain a student's access to learning. What that means is it is when an educator, and for me, if you've been following me, you know, an educator is one at any level, when that person is using their authority to advance opportunities or hold opportunities back. Their actions that are grounded in a person's belief system, not what they say they believe, but what they actually believe, because what you actually believe is going to always override what you say you believe. So understanding your instructional power is critical to the kinds of transformational work we talk about, that we say that we want in education, because educational power is real and instructional power is even more real. So, what are we going to be talking about tonight? We're going to be talking about Bobbie Mills and talking to Bobbie Mills. And so I'm excited to invite her to the stage, to invite her to our show. We look forward to having a great conversation. So to the show tonight is Bobbie Mills, and I want to just welcome you to Let's Talk Power Live. Let everybody know what you do, who you are, and let's get started.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Marshall, for having me on your show, Power, your podcast. And I just want to say I am thankful to you for creating a platform for leaders like me to be able to, talk about, power and to talk about, what's going on in the field of education, because this is important. So thank you so much for this. Just to let everybody know who I am Dr. Bobbie Mills, and I am the CEO and founder of Elevated Vision Educational Consulting. I am a former teacher, former assistant principal, former principal, and I am a district level leader. And I am also the author of the Assistant Principal's Path to Promotion. So that's my new book, and I'm really excited about that. Elevated Vision, I created this because I want to help assistant principals become principal ready from the AP seat. And so that's important to me. I have actually, been an assistant principal. I was an assistant principal for 11 years. I worked across 2 Title I schools as an assistant principal, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds because I know we got to talk. But just to give you a little background about who I am. So I have a heart and a passion for assistant principals because I lived in that world for a long period of time before I elevated up to higher levels. So I want assistant principals to know that I see you and I hear you. And that is why I wrote the book. And I wish somebody had written a book like this when I was an assistant principal. So I'm giving away gems in this book, guys. So
gems in the book. I can't wait. I'm excited. It is on deck. It is in my pile. I have already ordered it. I look forward to it. And how you describe your feeling about the book is exactly how I feel about when I wrote Let's Talk Power Live. When I wrote the book, Understand Your Instructional Power. So I am very excited about that. But as we sort of get into our conversation tonight about the idea of being principal ready, we're going to ground this in historical information about principals of color, namely Black principals. I talk about the life and structure of being a Black educator in the United States of America, which is an interesting prospect in lots of ways. And I do it unapologetically, so I'm okay with that. And we want to talk about the ideas that you're bringing forth through both of those lenses. So let's go ahead and talk about some data that I have come across so we can see it. So here we go. We want to talk about rising roles and yet this idea of unequal power. So first up, APs have more than doubled in classrooms since the 90s, right? So right now, across the United States, 61% of schools have an actual AP. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
That is true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's think about this one, though. This is an important stat here. About 80% of all principals once served as an AP. Why is that important?
Well, that's important because when you don't serve, when you skip steps, there are gaps. There are gaps. I have a story that I would like to share with you. When I was an assistant principal, I worked under many different principals in the span of 11 years.
Right.
And I had one particular principal that was promoted from being an academic facilitator to the principal chair. Never been an AP and was never a principal. So there were so many gaps culturally, strategically, and even instructionally, because this particular principal, she knew math as a facilitator, but she really didn't know how to teach the teachers how to, teach the math.
Right.
So there was just a lot of gaps there.
I would imagine, right? So the idea of there being operational gaps, logistical gaps. There are probably gaps around relationship making. You know what I mean? That
Yes.
is super huge to think about. So let's go to this next stat here. Only 24% of APs and 19% of principals are people of color. Now, I want to be clear about when we say people of color, we mean the spectrum, right? So if you joined me last week, you probably heard me drop the stat that 10 to 11% of principals were Black principals. So inside this 19% is that number. It's a bigger number. So we're talking about the entirety of principals of color. So 24% of APs are people of color. Why does that matter?
That matters because it's just, I'm trying to, let me see, let me get my words right here. Only 24% of APs and 19% of principals are people of color. It's just, we got to have more. I mean, I don't know any other way of saying it. We just have to have,
right?
We just got to have more, We just have to
Yeah.
have more. Our children, they need to see representations of us
Right.
in these roles. So, these numbers, they're not okay.
They're not okay.
They're not okay.
Lastly, Black APs are 18% less likely to be promoted to principal. Let's unpack that.
Well, let me say this. There's a difference between being needed for labor and being positioned for leadership.
Okay, stop. Positioned for labor and
being positioned for leadership.
Okay, what's that difference?
Well, historically, Black people, we were needed, but we were not positioned for power.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the assistant principal, even today, a lot of assistant principals are needed, but they're not positioned.
And what does that mean for positionality? How do we get to this idea of putting in place for your labor? So let's do two things. Let's talk about the labor. And let's talk about the leadership. So let's unpack the labor piece. When we think about APs, we think about APs primarily doing what?
Oh, we think about APs primarily putting out all the fires. They are doing buses, books, butts, handling all the trauma. They are just doing any and everything, but not being positioned for a leadership role. They're not being exposed.
And what are the exposure lines?
Well, the exposure lines are, being able to have access to the budget, being able to, because a lot of, principals, they gatekeep that budget. They don't want anybody to see that budget, how we're allocating those funds, how we're spending.
It's the black hole,
like holding it to the heart, holding it to the chest.
Exactly.
And, just getting involved in the instructional aspect of things, leading PLCs, coaching teachers, that's the line.
Yeah, it's funny. Midway in my career, I moved from New Jersey to North Carolina, and I'd been in the classroom for a little bit, and I'd been doing some mentoring and coaching, and we'd been invited to an institute, the Aspen Institute, as an entire unit. And at that time, our CAO was there, and she'd asked me a question: have you ever thought about being a principal? And immediately I said, before I could get my mind set, I was thinking about all the things that I saw APs do, and I immediately went to no. I don't care about lunch duty, because my thing is, if a kid's hungry, go feed the kid. Right?
Absolutely.
I didn't grow up taking a bus to school, so bus duty was beyond me. So the logistical pieces about being an AP really do weigh them down, right? I'm partnering with a district now, and I'm doing some extra coaching of the AP for the very reasons that you talk about. So let's go a step further and think through, what does it mean for an AP who wants to be a principal? How should they approach their self-advocacy when it comes to their own development?
Well, I will tell you a story what I had to do. Okay. So when I was an assistant principal, I was a great assistant principal. Everybody knew that they could rely on me. I was always there to, handle all the crises and the fires. So this one particular day, Dr. Marshall, I had gotten caught up on my referrals, go figure. And I was able to get into a classroom and conduct a walkthrough. And I walked into the classroom. I will never forget, the teacher was teaching the novel Where the Red Fern Grows. And she was walking around the classroom and she was reading, the kids were engaged, filling out their graphic organizers. And I just sat in the back and I was, just filling out my walkthrough instrument. And I noticed she went and she got some papers. And I looked and I said, okay. I said, she's going to give me the papers that the kids have so, I can look at it. And when I got there, when she got to the back of the room, she didn't even look at me, put the papers down. I picked them up and I realized, I was like, I know these are not referrals. She gave me 6 referrals. And I knew then I was not seen as an instructional leader. She saw me as someone that just handled the discipline. And so at that point, as a matter of fact, I had just gotten my doctoral degree. And I said, I'm just a glorified disciplinarian with a doctoral degree.
That's right.
And so at that point, I had to find my own voice because I was hot. Okay. So what I did, I scheduled a meeting with my principal. And I told her, I said, I've shared with you my aspirations, but, I'm still caught up in this web of just doing nothing more than discipline. I need your support. I need for you to allow me an opportunity to work with the content area so I can demonstrate my instructional leadership or my instructional power. And I knew that, they had a heavy focus on ELA and math in my building. And at the time, the school was becoming an academy. And so at the time we had, 10th grade. And I just came out and asked her, I said, let me work with biology.
I love it. Right.
Let me work biology. Now, let me tell you something. I was an ELA teacher. I had nothing to do with, didn't know the first thing about biology. But I went in there and I utilized my leadership skill sets and my skill set from being an ELA teacher. I knew how to look at data and break kids up into small groups. I helped the biology teachers with that. I also knew how to, break down a standard and unpack that standard, show them the specific vocabulary, because we know in science, vocabulary is key. That
is, if you can get the vocabulary in science, you are pretty much set.
You are set. You are
right?
set.
Because the vocabulary creates content.
Yes. So
Absolutely.
I did all of that, worked with them. Now, I will say first semester, biology, you have different kids each semester. First semester, we were sitting at 32%. After I started working with biology teachers, and mind you, we only had two biology teachers, but we went from 32% to 67%. And I knew then I had found my voice and my power.
So let's think about this.
Advocate for myself.
You had to step up into advocacy. Let's talk about this through that lens and press the point a little bit further. In the 4 dimensions I bring out in my book, Understanding Your Instructional Power, we talk about 4 dimensions, right? We talk about disenfranchising. We talk about power protecting, agency, which you just brought out because you talk about agency and you said in your example that you had to step into and advocate. And then we talk about empowerment. But I want to go back because when I look back at that stat we shared about the 18% less likely to be promoted, that feels like it sits inside history. That feels like it sits inside a gap between people's stated beliefs and people's
Mhm.
actual beliefs about who should be a leader.
Mhm.
And so, what does it feel like, look like, or sound like when an AP, a Black AP, is facing a principal who is power protecting their principal and creating an environment where they just cannot exercise their voice? How does that sit within the frame of history that we've experienced as a people in education? What are your
Well,
thoughts on that?
well, again, historically, we've only been needed and never positioned to be in power.
Hmm.
And that is why it's important for us to make sure that we are advocating for ourselves, because if we don't advocate for ourselves, then they're just going to keep us in that little box. I have been, again, I told you I was an assistant principal for 11 years.
And
11
that,
years.
like, think about that. 11 years.
11 years. I was an assistant principal.
That's a very long time.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? To be in that kind of a role when you want more,
Right.
right? When you want more. And so the idea of power and moving against a place where power protection is the model because of the authority is being held is interesting to think about.
Right. That is so true. So, there was one particular time where one of my principals was leaving to go on to a different career path. And, I was there, knew a little bit of, knew instruction enough to be able to, take over. And they just overlooked me and overlooked all the other assistant principals. And that's when they brought in this other principal. And I had been there at this particular school because I was at one school for 6 years and I was at my second school for 5 years. And it was my fourth year there. And I got looked over.
And you got looked over.
Got looked
Wow.
over.
Wow.
And so I realized at that point in time, again, I had to take my power back and I had to take control because I said, I am an instructional leader and I am more than a disciplinarian. And so I had to, just start applying outside of that box that I was in. And I eventually ended up getting a principalship and had the highest growth in my district. My first year, I moved my school from a D to a C.
Wow.
So I knew that I had it.
Right.
And it was always in me.
Right. Right. And that idea of being more than a disciplinarian, we see that model of, oh yeah, they can just handle all of the, like you said, the labor intensive pieces of it. And most importantly, or not importantly, but most troubling, I will say, is this need to keep APs of color, particularly Black APs, in the role of disciplinarian, particularly in Title I schools. Both you and I have been in Title I schools. And so we understand that Title I schools, number one, they very rarely get out of it. They very rarely come out of being designated as a Title I school.
Right.
And there are lots of conversations about
there's a lot of conversations about
that. That's the side topic. But inside that is this idea that the student population must be controlled and they have to be heavily managed. Mm-hmm. And so the principal will rely on a heavy-handed or a person that they believe can control the students.
Mm-hmm. I was that person.
You were that person.
I was that person. Yes,
right.
I was that person. I was the one they always called on the walkie. Hey, Dr. Mills, can you come up here and handle this student? Miss, Jones, she needs help with this student, and it all goes back to relationships. Mm-hmm. It all goes back to that, establishing relationships and also understanding the culture.
I keep asking, I was on a podcast a little while ago, maybe in November, and the podcast host said to me, what are your thoughts about culturally responsive education, and teachers being able to relate to their students. And she was making the case about, how do you teach quote unquote Black kids? That was basically her question. Mm-hmm. And I said, we have to ask a different question. The question is not about the students. The question is, why are we keeping this question going about asking why an adult, what it means to teach a certain kind of kid? The question is, why does an adult who chooses this profession have so much challenge being able to teach children who are different than them? Because we don't live in the time of the giver. Right. And if you read that book, The Giver, then you know what I mean when I say this.
Yes.
Right? If you haven't read that book, I invite you to go get it. We don't live in that. We don't live in a society like that. And so education is a choice. You get to choose your profession. So why do we keep asking people, APs, former APs, aspiring principals, to focus on this notion of teaching those kids or corralling those kids or using our bodies for labor and not leadership? Why does that keep going?
Well, I think it just keeps going because, again, like what I said, they don't understand, the culture, and they don't take the time to establish those relationships with our children and also with the parents. Now, granted, there are some parents out there, they're off the hook. Okay.
Yeah, they're interesting.
Yeah, they're interesting. They're off the hook. So I'm not saying that, you can establish a relationship with everybody. I am not saying that. I am a realist. But for a lot of our children, a lot of people, they don't take the time to really get to know them, get to know what their likes are, to, see what it is about them that makes them special. A lot of children, they just, want you to, come up to them and speak to them. Hey, how are you? It makes a huge difference with, especially our young ladies. I was in a school the other day and I looked at this one young lady and I said, sweetheart, I said, who did your braids? Because you need to come do Dr. Mills' braid. And she just looked at me and just smiled. And she saw me later on that day and gave me a hug. And then, I went back the next day because I was supporting this particular school, and she sought me out and found me and gave me a hug again and said, you really want me to do your braid? And I just kind of looked at her and I was like, okay. But just something as small as that makes a huge difference. But, it just goes back to relationship building.
Yeah. I want to ask you to give us one important framework piece, because your book is about frameworks for APs wanting to move into being a principal. Give us that top line, what you're trying to communicate through your book. One piece of your framework.
One piece of my framework, I would just have to say, one piece of my framework is the leadership mindset. And you have to make sure that you are a principal in your mind first, even though you're second in command.
Ooh, I love that.
You have to have that. You
principal have to, in your mind.
Principal in your mind, even though you're second in command. You still have to respect what your principal says, but you still have to carve your own path through your principal's vision.
I love that. Carving your own path, seeing yourself, right? You're really seeing who you are. I love that. That's a perfect segue into our power moves. Every week we do power moves. So I'm going to share some power moves with you and let's talk them through. So first, let's go ahead. We use the acronym POWER, not because education needs another one, but because this one works. And before I go any further, please have you hit that subscribe button, have you hit the like, and find someone to share this with. But look at this. The position is P. P is position. Clarify the purpose of leadership roles. This is for leaders to do, right? So that the assistant principals are developed as future instructional leaders, not permanent responders to adult needs. You talked about that.
Yes.
Right? Like this is position versus leadership. This is labor versus leadership, right?
Yes.
And then this idea of the ownership piece, create structured opportunities for assistant principals to make real instructional, cultural, and strategic decisions with coaching and reflection. Does that put them on the pathway?
That actually does put them on the pathway because those are the components that they are going to need to operate a school. Those are the components that they are going to need when they go into their interview and interview for that principalship. They are going to
Mm-hmm.
ask them questions from each one of these components that's in my framework. They're
I
going to
love it.
talk to you about the cultural leadership, the instructional leadership, the strategic leadership. You may get a question or two there, a little bit about discipline, but it's not going to be much. So you better make sure that you are familiar with strategic and cultural and instructional leadership.
Awesome. Then the W is for work. Redesign assistant principal responsibilities to prioritize teaching, learning, culture, and student outcomes over just that compliance, right? We know compliance has to happen sometimes, but
Yes.
we want APs on the pathway to principalship in a
Yes.
very new way. And then in the environment piece, at E, establish leadership cultures that provide mentorship, feedback, and psychological safety, right? That is that place where we want our APs to feel seen, like you already said, seen, valued. And then the R is relationships. Leverage mentorship, identity affirmation networks, and community connection to ensure leaders, especially those of color, are supported and seen. We want them to be put in the community, again, not as the corraler of cats, right? We want to do more
Right.
than corral the cats, but we want to really help AP see the vision, like you said, in your mind that you are a principal. And here are some things that principals do, the activities that principals do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we're
Yes.
going to continue our power moves. We're going to give 3 power moves, right? Number 1, we want them to move from position to influence, right? Seek decisions. You talked about this advocacy. Seek decisions that shape the culture. Name where responsibility exists without authority. Sometimes they have to do it, right? Um,
Yes.
Advocate, you said it, advocate for leadership experiences that expand the real power. Really speak up and speak out. Number 2, use their voice to expand access. You demonstrated that. You had to say, I want to do more. Speak to the inequities that are shown, that they see that, right?
Mhm.
Frame the concerns in terms of student access. If I'm an AP and I see a concern, rather than naming the leadership challenge, see it as this is going to impact student outcomes, right? And
Right.
then model that courage to do that work. And then finally, build influence before you hold authority. Shape culture through daily interactions. You talked about that, right?
Yes.
The coaching moments and the feedback. Lean into that. Become the leader that teachers seek for clarity, right? I remember my first AP. We want to trust, we want to build problem solving that sometimes sits outside of what the principal may allow, right? And
Mm-hmm.
all of these power moves are really about building an AP role that becomes foundation to effective trust building, principal leadership, foundational skills, and overall transformation for the school. Oh, that makes sense. Love that, right? These are the power moves that make a difference. And then I always end y'all with a gem. If you've been following, and I hope you have, each week we've been looking at our instructional power 101. If what Dr. Mills and I discussed tonight about power, about authority, about the kinds of conditions and environments that need to be created, and you want to explore that and deepen that, this is the course for you. 7 self-guided modules, and you walk away understanding your power ideology. But more than that, you walk away with strategies, structures, and systems to revolutionize your learning environment. So go ahead. The QR code is there. The link is there. Go ahead and get IP 101. And then let's just recap. Here's what we did. Leadership power is distributed, not accidental. Voice determines whether inequity is sustained or interrupted. Empowerment reshapes the future of instructional power. And then preparing principal ready leaders means redesigning what schools make possible. That's what we talked about tonight. And I'm so thrilled about that. if y'all been watching, you see this pin right here? This is the pin. This is the pin right there. The book is 3 years old, and we're having a celebration. Would love to have you join us. It is a member and subscriber only event happening next week. You get the opportunity to win a signed copy and this limited edition pin. Information is coming. Please join us. Would love to have you be there. This is Bobbie Mills. Dr. Mills, where can they get your book?
You can get my book at www.getelevatedvision.com.
Love that. And then if you don't have a copy of Understanding Your Instructional Power, please make sure you get it. We would love to have you join our conversation. So everybody, thank y'all so much for joining tonight. This has been a great conversation. Looking forward to having everyone join us next week for our exclusive member only and subscriber only event. Dr. Mills, thank you for joining Let's Talk Power Live.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.